My money.
Money.
I get money from you.
Money in the bank.
Young money.
Money, 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 money. It's the rich man's world.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!
World-renowned financial advisor and best-selling author Barry James Dyke will arm you with the truth. This is The Economic Warrior.
Please note, the opinions expressed on this show are of the individuals who speak them, and not necessarily of Portsmouth Community Radio, its members, or Board of Trustees.
Well, happy Wednesday, everybody, the January 16th, 2019, and we have a great guest on today. We're going to have Eileen Applebaum on from the Center for Economic and Policy Research down in D.C. We talk about private equity and Sears and so forth. Most people, Eileen, I don't know, when you're around friends and say you're at a cocktail party, do people really understand what private equity is?
Well, I think it's eyes glaze over as soon as you mention private equity. People think it's too hard to understand, but actually it's quite easy to understand. We wrote an article about private equity in groceries because people may not feel they can understand private equity, but everybody feels they know about groceries. So when you see it work, it's Midas touch for the private equity companies in this space. People really get it.
Yeah, you know, Eileen, you're one of the leading economists in the country in regards to private equity because you're one of the only brave ladies to speak out about this stuff. And you and Ludovic over in the UK, we had him on the show, by the way. But could you tell?
He's great.
Yeah, but he's great. Could you just tell us how our audience how big private equity is in the United States and the UK, and how big of an industry is it?
Well, it's huge. It's huge. There were 5,000 companies in the U.S. bought by private equity just in the past year.
5,000?
So they buy up companies. They buy up their workers. We could talk a little bit about the private equity model in retail. I think everybody has seen all the failures of the retail enterprises and the bankruptcies, everything from Claire's to Gymboree to Payless Shoes, just on and on. David's Bridal, you name something, there's probably a private equity firm that's driven a company in that sector into bankruptcy. 7 major supermarket chains went bankrupt in private equity hands in the last 3 years. So their model is the sweet spot for private equity is a company that owns its own real estate, has very little debt, and has constant cash flow that they can dip into. And that sweet spot is chains of fast food restaurants, chains of supermarkets, chains of retail stores. Retail is always a challenging business to be in, and companies learned long ago that if you're going to survive the challenges, be able to reinvent yourself, do what it takes to be competitive, you need to own your own real estate so that if things are going south for you, you don't have to pay rent. That's a big help. Have little debt, so interest is not eating up your earnings in the periods when earnings are not so high. And, of course, these are high cash flow industries. And private equity sees that, and they say, oh, great, we can load them up with debt because they don't have much. We can monetize their real estate by selling it off. We pocket all the money for the real estate, and the stores now have to pay rent. So this is not a good situation for the stores, and it's not hard to see why any challenge, of which there are many, can lead to companies entering bankruptcy. It's not just Amazon. It's not just Walmart.
Amen.
The challenge is, there are multiple challenges.
Yeah. Now but the bankruptcies have been huge, and I think and it's always been financial engineering. I think the real estate sale leaseback started with Cerberus. Remember them with Mervyn's?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and then let's see. There's been so many of them, and it's
right.
With the blessing of the internet. I mean, it's really out there to see, but there's only been so many people to really explain to the public, like yourself.
That's right. So Robert Samuelson in a column this week blamed the Sears demise on the fact that, oh, well, we now have Amazon, we have Walmart, and Sears just couldn't keep up. This is what the private equity industry says. This is what they want you to believe. But they want to take no responsibility. But what we know is Sears was so loaded with debt that back in 2011, when it first started to have problems and its share price tanked, nobody came in to buy it out because its debt was higher than its market cap. This is ridiculous.
Yeah, and then, because it was ESL Investments, which is Eddie Lampert, and we had Bill Cohan. I don't know if you know Bill. He writes for Bloomberg and Vanity Fair and so forth. But
sure.
And he's a great guy, and he interviewed Eddie Lampert. But the thing is, it always involves debt. And do people know that before Eddie Lampert kind of pushed Lands' End out the door, which is their clothing outlet, and then they had the Orchard Supply, which is a hardware supply primarily in California, that they loaded up the ESL including Ares Management out of Los Angeles, loaded up these companies with $500 billion, close to $900 billion in debt in a dividend recap. Could you explain to our audience what a dividend recap is?
Yes. So first they buy the companies and they load them up with debt, as you just said. It's just really very high levels of debt when they buy them. And people should realize that the private equity firm or the hedge fund owns the company. It loaded it up with debt, but it is the company that has to pay back the debt. And the hedge fund and the private equity fund are not on the hook to pay back that debt. So the company is now loaded up with debt. And what the owners, the private equity owners or the hedge fund owners want is they want a quick return on their money. And so they require this company, which they own, to go into the junk bond market, sell junk bonds, putting more debt on the company, and using the proceeds from that sale of junk bonds to pay dividends to the investors in either the hedge fund or the private equity fund. This makes no sense at all.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've been following PetSmart, because I kind of, before we had you on the show, I talked about PetSmart, and they're having trouble with their lenders right now because of they want to push off their online business, Chewy.com, to put it out of reach of creditors, in case they go into default. But you know what I've never seen, Eileen, is that BC Partners bought it. It was in 2016, and 10 months after they bought the company, they extracted $800 million in dividends. Why is anyone talking about this?
Yes, why is this not illegal? So in Europe, for example, they have adopted some regulations. And one of the regulations is that when a private equity fund or a hedge fund, any alternative investment fund, buys a company, it cannot take any kind of dividends, not out of the cash flow and not out of selling junk bonds and putting more debt on the company to pay the dividends for the first 2 years. You can't come in, buy the company in 10 months, make them go into the junk bond market, issue debt, use the money that they get by borrowing more money just to pay you, the investors in the private equity fund or the hedge fund, to pay you dividends. This is not legal in Europe. It should not be legal here.
Yes. Yeah, but it just goes on. The carnage continues. And I'm saying, because PetSmart, it's the largest pet store retailer in the country, probably if not the world. And this is going on in broad daylight. And BC Partners, I think they're from the UK. Am I correct? I
think so. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah. So they've done this with a bunch of companies, but no,
it's very common.
But I have, but also we have the question of which you brought out on the grocery stores, and I think who was the guy who wrote the article in the Washington Post on
Wiersky, Peter Wiersky.
Yeah, he's
on
great.
Marsh. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you explain not only they extracted all these fees and dividends and stuff like that, they put it into bankruptcy, and then the pension gets dumped. Could you explain what happens there?
Yes, that's so. The folks that suffer in the bankruptcy are the workers who will either lose their jobs or have to make concessions in wages and benefits to keep the stores running. The pensioners, because what happens is if it's a privately owned company like these supermarkets are, then we have something called the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, PBGC, and they can dump the pensions of the workers onto the PBGC, which does give you something, but not what you were promised. So, Sears has 100,000 retirees receiving pensions, and if those pensions are thrown onto the PBGC, all 100,000 of them are going to take a big cut in their retirement income. So that's an aspect that people are probably not focused on, but that's one of the things that you can do in bankruptcy. Get rid of the pensions that you owe your workers, and then some other company comes along and buys the company out of bankruptcy, but the pensioners are still in trouble. And the other group that gets badly hurt are the creditors. So in the case of Sears, in 2015, when it was clear they were in trouble, Eddie Lampert and his ESL hedge fund sold off more than 250 of the stores that were located where the real estate was really valuable. And they sold it to a company called Seritage that Eddie Lampert had also set up. So Eddie Lampert is the chairman of the board of Seritage. He's the president of Sears, and he sells the best properties from Sears to Seritage. That's no longer part of Sears, and in the bankruptcy proceedings, the creditors cannot get any of that money to help make up for what they lent the company and are not getting back. So they have no qualms about not treating creditors fairly, just the same as they don't treat the workers or the pensioners fairly in these situations. I mean, Eddie Lampert made a ton of money because Seritage then took these properties, developed one of them into a luxury shopping mall, developed another one into offices for high-tech companies. They're doing great. They're making tons of money on the Seritage side. And one other thing that we should pay attention to, because it tells you something about who's running our government. Our Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, is an investor in the ESL hedge fund.
Oh, is he?
And he was on the board of Sears for 12 years, watching it go down the tubes and pocketing all that money that the investors got. And now he's our Treasury Secretary.
Yeah, it's Seritage. Now, is Warren Buffett, did I hear from someone?
Yeah, I've heard that Warren Buffett is an investor in Seritage.
But
there are news reports that say that. I can't really confirm it, but I think that's true.
And the funny thing is that ESL Investments was, I guess it must be Eddie Lampert's initials.
Yes.
Some of his largest investors are David Geffen, the media mogul, and Michael Dell, who pulled off Dell Computer leverage buyout of them, which is one of the largest leverage buyouts of all time. And I think that the Tisch family, which they own Lowe's, I guess, and maybe Ziff Davis, the Ziff Davis Publishing. So we have some really big names here, and no one seems to want to pull it together.
Right. So what's interesting, the difference between a private equity fund and a hedge fund is that a hedge fund usually does not take over. Sears is an exception, but invests in publicly traded companies. So Sears is publicly traded and Seritage is publicly traded. So unlike private equity, which has very little regulation or oversight, publicly traded companies have lots of regulation and oversight. The Securities and Exchange Commission is their regulator. Where is the SEC in all of this? Why are they not out there defending the creditors, the workers, the pensioners, and so on? Why are they letting Eddie Lampert and ESL get away with this? That's my question.
I don't know. I guess I don't have a jet, and I don't have a private. My summer home is in Nantucket, Eileen. But So, but I'm going to ask you because you're in Washington D.C. Am I correct? And
yes, I am.
So I'm going to ask you some questions, and we're going to have to take a break in a little minute. But I mean, I look, and I look at private equity and finance in particular, and so much of it is centered in D.C. Did you see that Jerome Powell, who now is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, the Central Bank of the United States, was just interviewed by David Rubenstein on the Economic Club of Washington, D.C.
Tell your people who David Rubenstein is. He's the guy from Carlyle Private Equity Fund.
Yeah, him and his patriotic philanthropy. I call it patriotic carpetbagging. It's just
Yeah. Who are they to decide what are the worthy things to support? Let them pay taxes and let the taxpayers decide where the money should go.
Yeah, and so it's just because that's my next question. But the New Yorker did a great article a couple years ago about David Rubenstein. So for the record, and David Rubenstein, and he's grabbed more spotlight than I've never seen a picture he's tried to miss, and he's one of the co-founders of the Carlyle Group. Based in
based here in D.C.
Based here in D.C. and the three founders of some of the wealthiest men in America. They manage over $200 billion. According to their website. He's got his own show on Bloomberg, and he's he's on the board of the Harvard Corporation, that prestigious Ivy League up here, and last year, Eileen, I don't know if you saw this, but he got the Leader of the Year award from Yale in March last year. But
no, I missed that one.
Yeah, you get the Leader of the Year, Eileen, in March of 2018. Now, but get this: it was the same month that Rubenstein and the Carlyle Group put HCR Medicare into bankruptcy. And
right.
And they also put a month prior to that, they put Philadelphia Energy, which is the largest refiner on the East Coast of gasoline, into bankruptcy as well. Is everyone bought off by private equity in Washington, D.C.? You're on the ground there.
Sometimes you get the feeling that Wall Street is in charge of the executive branch of the government. I mean, President Trump routinely invites people like Stephen Schwartzman of Blackstone or others of these from Goldman Sachs or other of these Wall Street firms to watch television with him, to hang out with him, puts them in charge of important things in his administration. Wilbur Ross is a private equity guy. He's in big trouble right now because he lied about why he was putting a citizenship question on the 2020 census, and a judge has just said that's a no-go. He claimed it was for one purpose, and it turns out really it was to suppress responses so that immigrants would not want to answer, even if they were here legally, even if they were now citizens, and that would lower the count of people in states that have large immigrant populations, and that would lower their number of members of Congress and the amount of benefits that they get from the federal government and so on. So just a miserable thing to exclude states that have large immigrant populations from full participation in the political system. And a judge has just said this does not fly. But Wilbur Ross came out of private equity. So, what's to say? I mean, the Goldman Sachs guys, Gary Cohen, who was the top advisor on economic issues to Trump for the first couple of months or maybe a year of his administration. The private equity funds that said, we're going to finance Trump's investment in infrastructure. But they expected a huge giveaway from the government for infrastructure. That's when they would finance it, when they knew that it was going to be a winner for them. And of course, our government has not put up the money yet for investment in infrastructure. And it turns out that without that sweetener, private equity is not so interested in clean water, in transportation, in all of the kinds of infrastructure investment that we need so desperately in this country.
Yeah, and I could tell you, my youngest son, believe it or not, lives in Beijing, China, and they have a lot of pollution problems. But man, they have a lot better roads than we do. And but could you explain to our audience, Eileen, how two of the really big things, which really how the taxpayer subsidized the industry, amongst other things, about the interest deductibility of all the interest that they use, And number
Right.
one, and number two, could you tell us how carry interest works? So, to me, I just can't believe that still exists. But could you explain the interest
Right. So we'll
deduction?
start with carried interest.
Yep.
A private equity firm sponsors a private equity fund, and they recruit wealthy individuals, pension funds, especially pension funds. Our pension funds put up about a third of the money that goes into private equity funds, sovereign wealth funds, and so on, to put money into a private equity fund. For every dollar that pension funds put into the private equity fund, the firm puts in 1 or 2 cents. So they put in like 2 pennies when you put in a dollar. At the end of the day, despite all these bankruptcies, they call these companies portfolio companies. If you have a portfolio of stocks, some will go up, some will go down. You just hope your portfolio on balance goes up. So we have these bankruptcies, but the portfolio on balance generally does go up for the private equity fund. And when it does, then the private equity firm takes 20% of whatever the private equity fund earns. So they put in 2%, and they take out 20%. They take the lion's share of the winnings. And then what they do is they treat that as if they had put in money at risk, and therefore this should be treated as a capital gain. And capital gains, at least in the past, were taxed at a much lower rate than corporate profits. And, of course, one of the things that just happened is that the Trump tax cut has lowered the tax on corporate profits. But the capital gains in the past, at least, were taxed at a much lower level. And for all of those years, they got that tax break. They got 20% of the winnings, and then they paid very low taxes on that. So that's the capital gains scam that goes on. The other one that you were talking about is interest on the debt that a company has. So the way this works is that the companies owned by a private equity fund, now, as we talked about earlier, they've been loaded with debt, and they have to pay interest on all of that. That interest gets deducted from that company's profits before it pays taxes. So its tax burden is greatly lowered by that. And this then increases the after-tax value of this company. So it's a way of private equity or the companies that it owns avoiding paying their fair share of taxes.
Now, another thing which I didn't know, you told me the other week, is that when they do these dividend recaps, like when BC Partners levered up the heck out of PetSmart, or so there's a number of these, as you know, where they extract these enormous dividends. You said it actually improves their internal rate of return. I mean.
Yeah, that's another piece of it. So the internal rate of return, which is what the industry likes to use to measure its performance, is really a very bad measure of private equity performance. It's an algorithm. It just works. It's rule-driven. It has nothing to do with what's actually happening. So any money that is returned to investors early in the life of a private equity fund, and as you pointed out, they own that company 10 months and already paid themselves a dividend, right? That goes into this internal rate of return formula as something that really raises this internal rate of return, but that has nothing to do with how much money you as a pension fund and an investor in a private equity fund are going to see for your beneficiaries. It has nothing to do with it. And yet everybody agrees to use this particular very flawed measure. And it's not like there's not another measure. In the early years, we didn't have other measures. But in 2005, 2 very talented finance economists developed a different measure that really compares how the private equity fund is doing relative to publicly traded companies, the public market, the stock market. And that could be used, and that would give a much more valid picture of how private equity is performing. And one of the reasons they don't want to do it is that particular measure shows that the private equity funds launched after 2005, that is from 2006 on, all the way up to the present time, just about match the stock market. They don't do better than it. They don't do much worse, a little up, a little down. But on average, they're just matching the stock market. So the pension funds are putting all this money into private equity, which is very risky, which can lead to bankruptcies, which, in many ways is a poor choice of an investment. They do it because they are supposed to be getting all these super-duper returns. But, in fact, they're not getting the super-duper returns, and they'd be much better off investing in the stock market.
Yeah, and the whole thing is that, talk about retail bankruptcies. You familiar, Eileen, about Remington Outdoor, which was the which is the world's largest weapons cartel owned by Cerberus Capital.
Yes, that made the guns that killed the little kids.
Yeah. And was it in Connecticut? What was the name?
Yes.
But who was the? This is the irony of the whole thing. Is it to me? And it's really weird. It's kind of it's weird bedfellows is that these public pensions are in bed with these private equity guys. But you know who the largest limited partner was on the Remington Online?
Well, I don't know if they were the largest, but they were the most upset, and that was CalSTRS. The California Teachers Pension Fund.
Yeah, and yeah,
they wanted to get out. They wanted Remington to sell. They wanted the private equity fund to sell Remington. I think it was Cerberus, and they said, sure, if we get a good enough price, we'll do it. And there was nothing that the Teachers Pension Fund could do about that. Of course, since Trump has gotten elected, their sales have gone way down. Back in the Obama days, the people who buy Remington guns were loading up. God knows what they were expecting, but they were loading up with guns. Now they don't worry about it so much, and Remington, as you probably know, is also in bankruptcy.
And they put one of the largest creditors was the pension fund Marlin Firearms, which was part of their portfolio of companies.
Wow.
But get this one. I don't know if you followed this, but I have, Eileen, is that in 2010, Cerberus, they levered up, I think it was they called it the Freedom Group, prior to, because they always change the names to protect the guilty. But they levered up the company with $200 million in PIK notes to pull out a debt-funded dividend. Are you familiar with PIK notes?
Not that particular one.
Okay, yeah. Well, do you know you're familiar with PIK notes though?
So this allows them to take payment in kind and not have to actually pay money. I'm not sure how that all works.
Yeah. So the payment in kind notes essentially what they did is they sold debt, which is as Warren Buffett aptly said, how do you default on somebody to promise to pay nothing? And so they raised $200 million to PIK notes, and they extracted dividends. And I'm happy to share with you. I told you about the research I've been doing, but they've been used incredibly on Wall Street. So so one of the things which this is my opinion, my guesstimate is that, as you know, the last crisis, Eileen, was caused by debt and subprime debt. My feeling is that the leveraged loans and all this debt incurred by private equity, and not just private equity, but other people, could be really kind of a harbinger of things to come.
So we've looked at that here at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and we don't think that you have the same interconnectedness and the same level of indebtedness that we had in the financial crisis. We're not anticipating a financial crisis. But where you're correct is that there will be pain in some parts of the economy. And these highly leveraged loans and companies that really can barely afford them, any slowdown in the economy is going to lead to more defaults and more pain. So there will be pain, but we're not expecting a financial crisis.
You're not? Okay. So I just wondered because companies like, for instance, Netflix, it's really kind of, I love it. I'm a subscriber to it or whatever, but they've really grown primarily on debt. I mean,
yeah.
And so.
No, it's true. It's true. So there are companies that will not be able to sustain debt payments if there's even a slowdown. We don't even need a recession if there is a slowdown. And it's hard to predict which company it will be. but clearly there's going to be some amount of pain. I don't know about Netflix so much, but the private equity funds they have to match the Wall Street prices, and you've seen the stock market go up, raising valuations of companies, meaning that when private equity wants to buy a company, it's overpaying for these companies. So it's overpaying for these companies. It's loading them up with debt. How does anybody think they're going to make money out of this?
Well, they're going to make their fees. I mean, what's the
fees they will get? Absolutely, but the investors in the private equity funds, the pension funds, I think they're going to find themselves really disappointed.
Yeah, but it's when you look at it. If you look at say something like CalPERS, which that is the largest pension fund in the U.S. That's kind of like the pot of gold of private equity. Would you agree? Or
it is highly invested in private equity, and it has a new harebrained scheme for more investments with less accountability and less transparency in private equity.
And they're going to try to do it in-house? Is that?
That's exactly right. But in a way that is not accountable to the CalPERS Board of Trustees, which is what oversees that fund for the beneficiaries. So it's going to have a completely unaccountable in-house private equity operation going on. It makes no sense.
Let me ask you: this is we have quite a mess here, and the reason why I always get into it, Eileen, is that it's always about using and abusing other people's money, and when I look at the bankruptcies of say Caesars Entertainment, which was owned by Apollo,
right,
and Texas Pacific Group, they're using reserves from the Athene Insurance Company. As Caesars was marching towards bankruptcy, and no one seems to talk about it,
because private equity is hardly regulated at all. It's hard to find out exactly what they're doing. Nobody is looking at them, and they're not being held accountable.
Yeah, what would you suggest? Because obviously this is a subject people need to know more about. Because I think stewardship, particularly when you're investing other people's money. What would you suggest people do? And first of all, how do they get your books? And then one you did with Rosemary.
Amazon, it's available on Amazon.
And
I hate to say that, but that's probably the easiest way to get it. It's called Private Equity at Work: When Wall Street Manages Main Street. But they can go also to the CEPR website, just CEPR.net. And we have quite a few articles up there, including one on the poor performance of private equity since the financial crisis.
Yeah, because
it might have been a good investment before that, but it has not been since.
Yeah, but the I think the University of Maryland. I don't know if you saw that study, or I don't know, maybe quote me if I'm wrong, but I guess. After the financial crisis, roughly about 6% of the portfolios of pension funds were in alternatives, which would be private equity, hedge funds, distressed debt, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. And now, would you agree that it's somewhere around 26%? It's
well, for some, yes, it's certainly rising. I would have said about 20%, but it could be 26%. It's a couple of finance economists at Johns Hopkins that did that report.
Yeah,
they are first rate. So you can trust what they find.
Yeah. So it's the University of Maryland. I think. But anyway, But I was shocked. So also, and I talked to this prior to you having on the show, is that these funds, Blackstone and Carlyle and CVC and KKR, they're developing 15-year funds now. Have you heard about this?
Oh yes, this is all to the advantage of the private equity funds, and none to the advantage of the investors. Why any investor would do that? Tie up your money for 15 years, not 10 years, with no control over it, and just ride out whatever the fund managers who are partners in the private equity firms decide they're going to do with it. It makes no sense whatsoever.
I call it Hotel California money, Eileen. You can get it any time you want, but you can never leave. You
can never leave. That's exactly right.
And so it's.
I mean, it's to mask the poor performance. I mean, investors are going to find out sooner or later that the funds did not perform as advertised. And then what? Well, if they're locked up for 15 years, you get past that.
Yeah.
It's right now that private equity is buying high and wondering how it's ever going to make a profit. If you have 15 years, okay, maybe you can do something.
But also, wouldn't you agree? And this is I've had some very heated conversations with certain people. A lot of these private equity that is really good at spin. I'll give you a great example. Ludovic, how do you say his last name? He's
Ludovic Valapou.
Oh, Valapou. He was a great guy. And all these, like, they had, I call it like the Harvard mystique, that all these endowments make all these outsized rate of returns. But Ludovic did it, and he read his book, Private Equity at Work. He said if Yale actually got the returns that said it did in private equity, and they're also including venture capital in this, he said if they actually got those rates of return they quote, Yale would have like $6 trillion in their endowment. I mean,
right.
It's a lot of it's
they
just
don't get what they say, and it does set a model, and it really is unfortunate.
Yeah, because like Harvard, I know got 4.4% over the past decade, and that's the largest endowment and a college endowment in the world.
4.4% is not so good over the last decade.
Yeah,
the stock market did much better than that.
Yeah, but what they're doing to goose returns now too, Eileen, is that they're starting to take out. My assistant Tracy, if you're listening, she noticed this, and another. They're starting to take out the 2008 numbers to make things even look better. So when you take out 2008, it's
oh, that's convenient.
But the whole thing is that, and I have an actuary friend of ours, Steve. You're listening. He's an actuary and an economist. What we found, Eileen, on the pensions, long rates of return on pension funds really don't deviate that much from 30-year treasuries. I don't know. Have you found anything like that in your research?
So it depends on when you start the story. Before 2005, they were beating the treasuries. They were even beating the stock market at the median. So private equity was a reasonable investment.
Yeah.
At least you can make a case for it when it was 8% of your portfolio, and you're talking about before 2005. It's since then that the returns have suffered.
Yeah, it's just, but the amount of leverage buyouts in this country is just, I think it was The Economist. They did a study that there was like 25 leverage buyout companies in the 1980s, and I think according
we have a couple thousand now.
I think it's like Pregin, I forget out of London, said there's something like 6,600 worldwide.
PitchBook says there are about 4,300, but whether it's 4,300 or 6,600, it's not 25. And there's a lot of them competing for the same companies to buy, driving up the price, all of that.
Yeah.
So great. This has been really great.
This has been great. So, Eileen, how can people find more about you? Where they go to www.
Just CEPR.net. Put it in your browser. It'll take you right to us. And just put my name in the search. And
all right. Well, Eileen, we'll keep pushing back the frontiers of ignorance. This has been great, and you're a brave lady, and we love what you do.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I enjoyed talking with you.
God bless.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been The Economic Warrior with your host, Barry James Dyke. Broadcast live at WSCA Portsmouth Community Radio. Engineered by Phil Kleiger. If you have any questions about today's show or need an ally in conquering the battleground of finance, contact the warrior himself at barryjamesdyke.com.
Who are the warriors?